Welcome to Prospective Doctor's MCAT podcast, brought to you by MedSchoolCoach. Each week, Sam breaks down the highest yield MCAT topics so you can score as high as possible on test day.
Hello and welcome to a bonus episode of Prospective Doctor's MCAT Basics. Today we are discussing retaking the MCAT. And I'm here with Ken Tao, who is MedSchoolCoach's Director of MCAT Tutoring, and Sahil Mehta, who is the founder and president of MedSchoolCoach, and is also an interventional radiologist. So thank you guys both for being here. First of all, I really appreciate it. And what kind of got me interested in this topic, or got me thinking about this topic, was just about a year ago, I just got done taking the MCAT and then got my scores back kind of around the same time. And then, from there, I kind of had to decide, do I want to retake it? Do I not? So I thought this would be a helpful conversation to help some of you decide whether to retake the MCAT or not retake the MCAT. So with that said, Sahil, I want to start with you. What are some signs that say that I should 100% retake the MCAT? And what are some things I got to kind of balance and weigh in terms of making this decision?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. And thanks for having me on. I mean, I think this is a topic that I when I work with students, I get this all the time, right? Should I retake the MCAT? What should I do? I got this score. What do you think? I mean, those are topics that pretty much everybody who's ever taken the MCAT, unless you come out with like the equivalent of 525 or something, I think thinks about at some point in their MCAT career. And so, I mean, I think to first start with, what makes you definitely take the MCAT again, or where I think, somebody should definitely take the MCAT again, is really if somebody comes out with a score that's just way lower than what they were getting on practice tests, right? And that's fairly obvious, but I think that's a good starting point as an indicator to think about, which is to say, hey, if somebody was scoring a 515 on their practice test and then on test day, got really nervous and left the last three sections completely blank and ended up getting a 501, obviously that's a person who I would say you need to retake the MCAT without a doubt. Now, there's like 1,000 other scenarios where you may retake the MCAT, but I think to summarize it, you have to think about what your goals are, right? What are your goals? Is your goal to get into a top 10 school, a top 20 school, any med school, any osteopathic school? So you have to kind of, every single situation, every single scenario is different, because you really have to make sure you understand what your goals are and understand where your score fits in to those goals. So if you're a underrepresented minority who got a 515, that might be a tremendous score, and it might be something that is going to get you into pretty much any school in the country, or really get you competitive for a lot of schools in the country. Conversely, if you're a Asian applicant from California and you got a 512, well, if your goal is to really just stay in California and be at UCLA or UC San Diego, well, maybe we need to look at it and see, how are you doing on practice tests? Do we think you need to retake it? Can you do better, et cetera, right? So it's unfortunately in some ways a very personalized situation, but it's a situation that everybody comes across, or the question comes across to every single person.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And kind of a follow-up question to this, Ken, you brought up the point of unbalanced scores. So could you talk a little bit about what an unbalanced score would look like, and kind of when that is an indicator of retaking the MCAT?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, as with Sahil, thanks for having us on the podcast today. It's great to be here. In terms of unbalanced scores, this is for students that have a score where you have some sections that are very good and maybe one or two sections that isn't very good. This is most common with students for the CARS sections. The CARS section is the critical analysis and reasoning skills section. We often have a lot of pre-med students with a strong science background, so they might get 127, 128, 129s in the science sections and then end up with a 122 or 123 in CARS. So that's an example of an unbalanced score. And in those cases, the students almost have to retake the MCAT. And that's just because when you are applying for medical school, as Sahil was referring to earlier, you do want to look at the schools you want to apply to and look at the scores at those schools. It's for most schools, you're going to find that the scores for each section, there's these ranges of scores for each school. And it's not very common that you have schools that will say accept students with high science scores but a really low CAR score. So that means you really want to have your scores as balanced as possible. Now, in terms of balancing out the scores, if the lowest score is the CARs, that can be a challenge for a lot of students. A lot of them might think that, oh, well, since my science scores are fine, then I might be okay. But you have to recognize that that's just not the way that the score is viewed. There's also some situations where some students think, oh, because of my background, because English is not my first language, it's okay for my CAR score to be lower. But that argument also doesn't work, because if you have high science scores, clearly you're able to understand the English language well enough to be able to get such high science scores. So in cases where you have an unbalanced score, especially if it's low in CARs, then you would definitely want to retake.
All right, that totally makes sense. And one thing, when I got my score back, my score was a little bit unbalanced in the way you're talking about, is that my CAR score was a few points lower than my science and my psych social scores. And so I kind of was doing this analysis a little bit. And one thing that helped me is you can kind of go on to, I think it's the MSAR sheet, if that's what it's called.
The AMSAR.
Yes. And you can get the average of the subscores for the different schools, and you can kind of see where you fall within a certain range. Are you in the 10th percentile, the 20th percentile of this certain subscore range? So that kind of helped me see, okay, is my score so low that I'm not going to be able to get into X school that I want to apply to? So that was one resource I used to kind of determine whether or not I wanted to retake the MCAT.
And I'll jump in there. I mean, I think the AMSAR is a phenomenal resource, and both you and Ken just mentioned it as really being able to understand what scores an average matriculant has at a particular school. I would just caution applicants against using it as a be-all and end-all and just saying, because I'm in that range, I should be good to go, kind of. It's the average matriculant, which, if let's say that the average CAR score at a particular school, let's just take the average MCAT score at a particular school as, let's say, a 516, just to pick a random number. That does not mean that just because you have a 516, you're going to get into that school, right? It just means that the average matriculant to that school has a 516. They may have rejected literally 100 to 200 people with a 516 for every one person with a 516 that they accept. So while it's a great resource to kind of gauge the balance of your scores and where you may fall, make sure that you don't use that, I would say, as a misjustification of your competitiveness level for any given school, because I see a lot of applicants doing that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And kind of on the same topic of schools, Sahil, how do schools look at multiple MCAT scores? Do they superscore them, i.e. combine the scores and kind of take the average of both of them? Or I guess superscores where they take the highest subscores. Or do they average them? Or, how exactly does that work?
Yeah, so each school has slightly different ways to deal with different MCAT scores, right? It's not as cut and dry as, let's say, the college admissions process, where a lot of schools actually just publish what they do. And a lot of schools say, we'll superscore your SAT or ACT score. For medical school, no school actually publishes what they necessarily do per se, but schools definitely take all this into account, right? And it's sometimes a little bit more even subconscious than anything else, which is to say, if I look at an AMCAS application and I see a 509 one time and a 518 the next time, and I see somebody with a 3.9 GPA, I already know that, okay, you know what, that 509 was probably a bad day, right? Or something went wrong. Everything else in their application tells me that this is more that 516 student, or I don't remember what score I just used, but that higher score student, right? And so in that case, I'm just going to take the higher score, and that's what's going to go into my thought process in ranking an applicant or thinking about if I'm going to accept them or not. Conversely, if scores are all relatively similar, right? If at the end of the day you end up with a 514 with a 121 in each section or something along those lines, and the next time you end up 1 or 2 points within each section, CARs went down, psych social went up, bio went down, chem went up, whatever it might be. and there's not much variation there, then I'm not going to sit there and all of a sudden take each and every top score and say, well, you're 6 points ahead of where you started. If the overall score is relatively similar, then it's not necessarily that I'm going to super score an applicant and kind of aim for extra points. It kind of goes more in the context with the remainder of the application.
One thing that I was wondering, is it kind of a myth that, or I guess you can confirm or deny this, but is it true that schools will see you score twice similarly on the MCAT and then kind of not necessarily basically that harms you? So what I'm trying to say is, will schools see that you took the MCAT twice, and if you scored both times, they'll kind of count that against you? No,
definitely not. And, I've heard this multiple times, but the reality is, again, I'm picking out some scores here, but let's say you get a 512, right? Yeah. And then you get a 512 the next time. Well, fine. You're a 512 applicant. Like, that's who you are. It hasn't hurt you to retake it again. And for me to see that that's your score. Now, even similarly for some people, and I know there's probably some people out there who are thinking about even taking it a third time, which is definitely not unheard of. And definitely, there's applicants who do that. And oftentimes I tell them, well, if you get the same exact score, you get the same exact score. That's who you are. But if you can up your score by 10 points, well, that's great. Now, I don't recommend taking it 3 times. I'm not saying that that's what every student should do by any means whatsoever. It's like a case-by-case basis. But I really would dispel the myth that if you get the same score twice, that's a huge red flag, or that a school is going to look at you poorly because of that. No, that it is who you are. You're a 512 applicant at the end of the day if you get that score twice.
Okay, gotcha. So this question is for both of you, and I guess, Ken, you can start first. What resources are there out there for students to kind of help make their decision on whether or not to retake the MCAT?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first is one that Sahil has already referred to, which is just what was the student's progress during their studies when they were taking practice exams? How did those scores compare with their performance on test day? So certainly if there's a substantial discrepancy where they were doing better in practice, that is already enough for the student to say, I can do better, and retaking the test could certainly be worthwhile. There are other resources that can be helpful. We've already discussed the MSAR. Another one that is helpful that the AMC has released is on their website. They do have this grid that compares the MCAT with the GPA. So that's kind of helpful because in addition to looking at just your MCAT score, you can take into account your GPA and look at other applicants to see what percentage of applicants with that GPA and MCAT score combination did get an offer letter from medical schools. But similar to what Sahil said earlier, if you look at some of those numbers, you can say, oh, if I have this combination, I have a 75% chance of getting in, which isn't completely true, because when you look at the numbers, it's true that of the 2,900 students with those stats, 2,200 got in, but that's also 700 students that didn't get in. But those are certainly some of the resources that you can take a look at.
Cool. Yeah, and just to jump in real quick, I like that grid that the AAMC puts out. It's kind of interesting. It does kind of show you that there's more than just GPA and total MCAT score, right? If you look at like the category that's the highest MCAT score, which is greater than 517, and then the highest GPA, which is greater than a 3.79, still only 88% of those people got into medical school. So there's still 12% that didn't get into medical school. So it just goes to show, obviously, that there's more to just GPA and MCAT to getting into medical school.
Yeah, I love that table. I live by that table, which is table 23. If you want to Google it, and we can put it in the show notes too, I'm sure, Sam. But it's really a great resource. And actually, they have further tables beyond that actually break it down by ethnicity, which I think is really interesting. So you can kind of pick your ethnicity and kind of break it down and say, okay, you know what, I'm a Caucasian male, or I'm a South Asian, or I'm an underrepresented minority. Where do I stand in the entire applicant pool? It really gives you a great idea. And I would definitely highly recommend that all applicants sort of use that table as an understanding. But just as you mentioned, and Ken mentioned as well, it really paints the picture that, hey, even with these great scores, even with these great MCAT and GPAs, there are several people in those categories that are left out. In fact, in some scores that are, you would think, really, really good, like let's say of greater than a 517, if your GPA is a little bit on the lower side, only, let's say 60% of those people get in. So it's really a great table to look at. I would throw in, just another resource to really think about if you should retake the test or not, is sitting down with somebody and really understanding with where you stand currently and making sure that your timing is correct in thinking about retaking the test or not. And that's something we haven't really touched on, but that is an important factor in this, because I get a lot of students who I maybe work with who come to me for advising, and they say, well, I'm thinking about retaking the MCAT, but it turns out that their timing is just completely off, because by the time their MCAT score comes out, they would already have been rejected by schools, or schools won't look at that score, or that or maybe it is that they have plenty of time because they've already submitted their application is verified. So the next score that comes out is going to be out in a good amount of time for schools to look at. But I do think you need to take all that into account when you think about retaking a test, particularly if you're in the middle of an application cycle or just going into an application cycle. You got to think about that. You can't just willy-nilly go in and retake it or not retake it. You can do that a little bit if you are, let's say, a year or two before an application cycle, because then you don't have to worry about it. But if you're in the middle of an application cycle, you should really get some assistance in making sure that your score is going to be looked at in the right context and that your application is going to be complete in the right time.
Right. And so would you briefly just give a little bit on that of when does timing matter, and what do you have to take into consideration there? Yeah.
So, in general, the med school application timeline basically goes as such. It kind of starts in June when you can submit your application, and this goes for both DO and MD. You can submit your application, and then you get verified by July. And the earlier you submit your application, the better. So we try to get applicants to submit applications in June for the vast majority of them. Now, that's all well and good, but let's say that you don't get your first score back until mid-July, and you haven't submitted your application yet, and now you've decided to retake it, and your first score is not good enough to even apply to school, and you say, okay, I'm going to retake it in August, and then I'm going to get my score back in September, and then I'm going to apply. Well, the reality is if you've applied in September, you're too late. You're really throwing away an application because you're very late in the season. So you have to really have your MCAT scores, I would say, in and ready by August at the latest for any given application cycle. And that really means that you would have taken it in July. And so working backwards even a little bit more than that, that means you would have to have gotten your previous score in June to even be ready to register and take it in July and study for it again. So, there's a lot of complex moving parts here that I think oftentimes when people are just thinking about it off the bat, they don't realize, right? So I got my score 4 weeks after I took my last test. I probably haven't studied for the last 4 weeks because I've been waiting for my score. So it's not like I'm fresh on the material. Now I'm going to go register for the next test date. Well, the next test date might be 4 weeks away. It might be, 6 weeks away, whatever it might be. But now I got to restart studying. Is that enough time for me to really make a difference in my score? All these things are things you got to factor in before you decide if you're going to retake it or not.
Yeah, it's a complex decision. And, this is something I didn't have to think about. So even just, me trying to think about this right now, it's complex. And so it's a tough decision.
Thanks for checking out the ProspectiveDoctor MCAT Basics podcast. Sam's doing a killer job taking you through the most important MCAT topics, but what if you need a little extra help? How does a 5, 10, or even 15-point increase in your score sound? Imagine how your chances at admission could increase. MedSchoolCoach's MCAT Tutoring can get you there. With the most rigorous selection process of any tutoring company, we see amazing results. We deconstruct each student, find a plan that is going to work, and help execute it. That's why our students add an average 12 points to their score. completely physician-run and operated and focusing on nothing but medicine. It's no wonder over 10,000 past students have trusted MedSchoolCoach to get them through the MCAT and into medical school. Check out MedSchoolCoach.com today and mention code PODCAST for 5% off.
All right, so this next one is for you, Ken. So imagine that I'm a student and I come to you and I say, I just worked super hard for the last 3 months. I studied my butt off and got my score back, and it's not a good score. And, it's not going to get me into the schools that I would like to go to. So what advice would you give the student to improve their score? And what advice would you give them to try to help them figure out what exactly is going wrong in their study?
Yeah. So the first thing is this is very situational. It's going to depend on the student. So this happens all the time. We have students come to us and I have a conversation about how they prepare for the MCAT and how the MCAT actually went. So some of the questions I might ask them would be, how are you doing your practice tests and how did you end up doing on test day? If there's a discrepancy there, I might ask questions like, was there anything that you did differently on test day? Some things that might sound silly would be occasionally we have students who sign up for a test date that they want, but at a testing center that is a little far away. So because they're concerned about traffic, instead of driving an hour and a half or 2 hours in the morning, they decide to get a hotel by the testing center. And then they say that the hotel was kind of funky. They weren't able to sleep. So because of that, they pulled an all-nighter and took the MCAT without any sleep. So certainly in some of those cases, it can be easy to identify why the student might not have done as well as they expected on test day. But at the same time, there are many students where they will say that test day went fine. They actually felt really good about the exam, but for some reason or another, they just didn't do as well as they hoped. So in those cases, it's more complicated. So I have to do a more thorough analysis of how they prepared for the exam. And I really start from the basics. So I'll ask them, what did they major in school? Did they take all of their prerequisite courses for the MCAT? How did they do in those courses? Which of those subjects are their strengths? Which of them are their weaknesses? How did they prepare for the MCAT? When did they start preparing for the MCAT? Did they take an MCAT course? Did they do tutoring? What are the resources that they used? If they use MCAT books, from what company? If they did practice tests, what company's practice tests did they use? Did they use the AMC materials? There's really all these questions that I ask to try to identify where the student may have gone wrong. And there's really a whole multitude of possible reasons why students may not have done as well on their MCAT as possible. And the purpose of me asking those questions is to try to identify everything that the student may have done incorrectly. Now, to give some examples, I'll talk about some of the most common mistakes I hear from students. So the first is relying too much on the materials from test prep companies. Now, test prep companies, of course, are fantastic, and many of them have fantastic MCAT books and practice questions and practice passages that students should use. But these companies, their questions are not the same as the ones from the AAMC, who are the creators of the MCAT. So that's a common mistake, relying too much on the resources from test prep companies and not using the practice questions from test prep companies. Another common mistake is not allocating enough time to either content review or practice, right? So they often hear from their friends, oh, practice is really important. So they do a whole bunch of practice tests, maybe pulling 10 practice tests from one company, 5 from another, and 5 from another, but they never do the content review that they needed in the first place in order to be able to answer those questions correctly. Or other students that just make errors such as they focus too much on the science sections. They don't think that the car section is a section they can improve in, so they just never bothered working in that section. So those are some of the common mistakes. There are certainly a lot more, but the key there, if a student wants to improve, is really to do a thorough analysis of how they prepared for the exam and try to think about where they went wrong in their study process. And then when they retake their MCAT, make sure they address those issues. And that can be hard to do. So certainly if a student finds that they're not able to do that with their own reflection, then certainly reaching out to others for help is great.
One question that I kind of was thinking about on my own is, what happens if I've taken all 3 of the AAMC full-length tests? Because I think these are kind of generally understood to be the gold standard of practice tests, and I think a lot of people use them as reference for how well they'll do on the actual MCAT. So if I've already taken those 3, how do I kind of gauge where I'm at in terms of what I will score on my retake?
Yeah, so that can always be a tricky situation. The unfortunate news is anytime a student retakes the MCAT, they have to redo all of the AAMC practice materials. And the main reason why is just because those are still the best practice materials available. And the AAMC has a very distinct way that they write their questions as well as write the trap answer choices. So when a student sort of decides, oh, well, I've done these questions before, I also want to do some practice tests from other companies at the same time. The problem there is they never learn the way the AAMC writes their questions, and they don't learn to identify the common types of trap answer choices that you see over and over again in AAMC questions. So that's why it's so important to make sure that you redo the AAMC questions every time you take the MCAT. Now, in terms of what you're describing, certainly when you retake the AAMC practice test, it can be a little hard to think that the score is actually valid, right? You might think, oh, well, the first time I studied for the MCAT, I was getting around 507 to 508 on the practice test. Now that I'm studying again for the exam, I'm getting a 512, 513. But is that actually an improvement? Or did I really just remember the questions from before and that's why I'm doing better? It's certainly possible that's the case, and very hard to rule out that the improvement might be due to the fact that you've already seen the questions in the passages and the solutions before. But what I can tell you is there are many students that that have come to us and they have taken the MCAT more than once. They've done the AAMC practice questions more than once, and their performance on the AAMC practice questions did not change from one MCAT attempt to another MCAT attempt. So that does mean that if you retake the AAMC practice tests, if you improve, that does have meaning. So I think that you shouldn't disregard your improvement completely on the AAMC questions, but at the same time, you do have to be a little careful because certainly recall and familiarity with the passages and questions can potentially inflate your scores a bit.
Yeah, no, that's good to know that people have been able to retake them and kind of it still gives somewhat of a compass to how you're going to score on the actual MCAT. This question is for both of you, and Sahil, I'll start with you. And Ken, you kind of answered this a little bit already, but how do people know if they should sign up for MCAT tutoring or MCAT or an MCAT course to be able to improve their score for their MCAT retake?
Yeah, I mean, I think that to start with the tutoring aspect of things, I mean, one-on-one tutoring can, in my opinion, pretty much always help somebody. Particularly those students who just didn't score as well as they wanted to, really hone in and understand what their weaknesses were and why they didn't. As Ken mentioned, I mean, one of the things we do at MedSchoolCoach is kind of really go through and understand, where that student went wrong and kind of figure out, what it was that didn't go correctly. And I think having somebody who's done this 1,000 times and really be able to make an impact on it is huge, because as a student, you may not always see that, right? You're sort of stuck in that middle of test prep and maybe it's the content that you're just focusing in on, but maybe you just didn't even realize that you were missing how to answer these questions correctly or even figure out what the question stem was, right? I mean, all these things are things that like a professional tutor can help you with, somebody who's well-trained and somebody who really can move the needle. So to me, if you if you haven't gotten the score that you're looking for by self-studying, then I think it's totally reasonable to start looking towards a tutor. Now, unfortunately, not everybody can afford a tutor. Not all tutors are good. So you should really take some of this you should really make sure that what you're getting is what you're paying for. Particularly if you're going to pay for it, you should really make sure that you're getting high quality tutoring, not just some generic person on the street who can teach you a little bit of X or Y, but maybe doesn't know anything about the MCAT or something along those lines. And then in terms of a course or not, there's a lot of great resources out there, some of which are totally free, like Khan Academy. I mean, Ken can speak to this a little bit better than I can, but there are a ton of great resources that people can use where you don't necessarily need to have a course. But if let's say tutoring is out of your budget, but a course maybe within your budget, and you didn't score as well as you wanted the first time, I mean, I'll just speak to this and say that this test is so important in your med school career, and their cost of unfortunately, your cost of a medical education is going to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollar range, no matter which kind of school you go to, no matter what way you go. And so a tutor, a course, any of these things is really a drop in the bucket comparatively. And some people get a little short-sighted on this. Without scoring well on your MCAT, you can forget about getting into medical school. So it really is, one of the most important, if not the most important test in your life if you're thinking about becoming a physician, right? So I would say pour the resources in that you can in order to score as high as possible.
Right. Awesome. And just to throw in a quick thing here, I think that there's a ton of free resources out there, right? You mentioned Khan Academy. You could always talk to a friend, that's done really well in the MCAT. Maybe they're willing to sit down with you and kind of look over some stuff. There's some good podcasts out there. So anyways, Ken, what do you have to say on this topic?
Yeah. So certainly this is a common question that many pre-medical students will think about at some point when they're about to prepare for the MCAT exam. I would say the first thing is the vast majority of students who take the MCAT just self-study for the exam. So there's certainly nothing wrong with studying for the exam by yourself. I would say the advantages of taking an MCAT course as well as tutoring is it can make your study progress more efficient. So what I mean by that is every student is going to have some content gaps. These content gaps could either be some topics that they never really understood that well in their college courses, or content topics that just weren't covered in their college courses and they're learning for the first time. If you're going over one of these topics by yourself, it can take you quite a while to figure it out, or you can read the chapter in the book. And if reading the chapter in the book doesn't work, then you can go on YouTube and really just look up the topics online. These days, YouTube is really quite fantastic. For just about any topic you want to review, you can just type it in there and the relevant video will pop up. And certainly for a lot of those MCAT topics, Khan Academy will show up, which is great. But there's a lot of other YouTube channels that have started making videos for MCAT students. Now, if you think about all the time that it takes you to find those videos and watch those videos, it can take hours for you just to figure out a single topic, when instead, you can just have someone teach that topic to you in a very short period of time. Now, both a course and tutoring can work, but of course, within a course, you don't really get to choose what topics you want to go over in each class, right? The course has a set curriculum, so in each class, they're going to go over certain topics. So that's the downside there, where if you want to study the most efficiently, then tutoring is the best, because tutoring is perfectly customized to you. So whatever topics you want to go over, the tutor can teach you. But I would say the advantage of both taking an MCAT course and tutoring is you're working with an MCAT expert. So the MCAT expert knows what students need to know in order to do well in the exam. So that way, when you're studying a particular topic and you're wondering, hey, is this something that I need to know for the exam? You should be able to ask your MCAT instructor or tutor, and they can tell you. So that way you're studying what you need to know and not stuffing your brain with a bunch of random facts that isn't going to be tested on the exam. Also add, of course, what Sahil was mentioning earlier, and that is definitely make sure you be careful before signing up for an MCAT course or an MCAT tutor. There are a whole bunch of companies out there, and they'll all say fantastic things about their companies, but sometimes those companies may not be quite as good as they say they are. Examples include just companies who hire experts in certain subjects. So you can have someone who has a PhD in chemistry but has no idea what chemistry students need to know for the MCAT. Or you can have a company that says that they have tutors that did great on their MCAT, but you find out that the score requirements for their tutors is actually quite low. So in that case, if your tutor only scored a point or two higher than how you scored the first time, are they really going to make you improve significantly the second time around? So all good things to consider.
Yeah, definitely. Well, before I let you guys go, I just want you to summarize kind of summarize the advice you would give to a student who just got their MCAT score back and are kind of disappointed. Ken, I'll start with you. What's in like a paragraph? What's your advice to that student?
Yeah. So the first thing you want to do is first figure out if the score that you received is enough for what you need, right? So take a look at some of those resources we discussed from the AMC. Check out the scores from the schools that you are interested in applying to. If your score perhaps is good enough plus the rest of your application, then perhaps you can go ahead and apply with your score. If you decide for some reason that your score isn't good enough or you want a higher score, then you want to do a self-reflection on what you did wrong the first time and what you need to do differently to improve your score. And if you're having difficulties with that reflection, if you're not sure what to do to improve your score, then definitely look for help. That's what I'd say.
Awesome. Sahil, what about you?
The first thing I say to an applicant who gets a score back and is disappointed is breathe, because it's super easy to start freaking out in that moment, right? You get the score back, it's not as high as you thought it was going to be, and all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose, right? Your parents are on the phone, everybody's calling everybody, my dreams are shattered, I'm never going to be a doctor, et cetera, et cetera. Like, just take a second and breathe, because I do think that that's an important piece of advice. Listen, I can tell you, I work at one of the Harvard hospitals, and every single day I pass hundreds of doctors, probably 75 of whom got their MCAT score back when they did and were disappointed or not as happy as they wanted to be the first time around, right? And probably 25 of them, or maybe even 50 of them, were freaked out and thought about, do I have to retake this test? And maybe even retook the test at some point. So you're going to be okay, right? Like, it's definitely an important test, but just because you got one score that was disappointing to you, take a breath, take some time. You'll get to where you need to be at the end of the day, with the resources that you have available. So step one, breathe. Step two is exactly what Ken said, right? Let's evaluate. Let's see where you stand. Let's think about how you're doing on a practice test. Let's think about what your goals are. And let's see if retaking the test makes sense for you, right? A lot of people retake the test. Tons and tons of applicants retake the test, and it's not the end of the world to retake the test. But it's also not always necessary to jump in and retake the test, right? Depending on what your goals are and where you stand, it might be a situation where you look at it and say, you know what, you're fine. You don't need to retake the test just because, this score was a little low, we're going to risk going down on the other sections because, your other section was super high. So maybe it's not worth you retaking the test because everything else lines up and you probably are going to get an acceptance with where your application stands. So I think, doing that reflection is important. Breathing is important. Retaking the test is fine if you have to go down that route. If you do go down that route, think about the things that you can improve upon. Don't do the same thing again, which is to say, don't study the same exact way again. Like, take some time and reflect and get some help if you can get it, if you need it. Figure out what went wrong or what wasn't maximized, and then you can go forth and retake it again. I do come across a lot of applicants who just say, well, I'm just going to take it again. And I don't think that's the right way to go. I think you have to have a plan to attack it again in either a slightly different way or in a completely different way, depending on what went wrong. And that's something that you can get from a variety of sources. Obviously, we can help you with that, but there are other sources out there that can help you as well in figuring that out.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that advice. And I hope somebody out there that just got their scores back is listening to this and kind of has hope in that message. And so I think that concludes this interview. I really appreciate it, both of you. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no problem.
As always, thanks for listening to the podcast. If you liked it, please go leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us with the rankings and helps us reach more students. And as I was saying, I really do hope this podcast helped some of you decide whether to retake or not retake the MCAT. It's a tough decision, one I definitely had to grapple with. Good luck in making that decision.
Thanks for listening to Prospective Doctor's MCAT podcast. If you're a pre-med, you'll want to check out ProspectiveDoctor.com for tons of free tools, articles, and more podcasts that cover your pre-med life. And if you need help on the MCAT or getting into med school, check out